We're going to talk a little bit about personality psychology today. And by way of beginning, I'd like to focus on just, I guess, some of kind of the early conceptualizations of personality, because I think that's a helpful starting place. By way of beginning today, I'd like to acknowledge that as we engage in remote teaching and learning, I'd like to acknowledge that the Saskatoon campus of the University of Saskatchewan is on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd also like to recognize that some may be attending this course from other traditional Indigenous lands. I ask that you take a moment to make your own land acknowledgement to the peoples of those lands. In doing so, we're actively participating in reconciliation as we navigate our time in this course, learning and supporting each other. So, one of the big questions of psychology is this idea of conscious versus unconscious processing. And one area that is a particularly interesting place to kind of look at it is this idea of Freudian slips. So us saying things that we didn't actually mean to say, but perhaps we did. So there's a great little video that you can kind of watch to kind of set that up for you. And with that, I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about psychodynamic theories of personality. So the psychodynamic theories are theories that explain behavior and personality in terms of unconscious energy dynamics within the individual. And it's not to be confused with psychoanalysis, which is connected to it but is a little bit separate from it. So psychoanalysis is both a theory of personality as well as a method of psychotherapy that was developed by Sigmund Freud. And the main emphasis for psychoanalysis is unconscious motives and conflicts. The goal, therefore, of this theory of this intervention would be to make the unconscious conscious. So to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, Freud had a very involved theory about how the personality develops. And so he believed that that personality first began with a component called the id, and this was present at birth. And in the id is the reservoir really for all unconscious energies and motives. And the id's main goal is to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. Now, the id is fueled by libido. So libido is the life and the sexual drives, and thanatos, which are the death and the aggression drives. Like I just said, it's governed by this pleasure principle, so we want to avoid pain and we want to maximize pleasure. After the development of the id, the second structure to develop is the ego. And the ego tends to be kind of a referee between the needs of instinct, so the needs of the id, and the demands of society and other higher forms of morality. Now, the ego is governed by the reality principle. So instead of it being driven by pleasure, it's driven by what is the reality of the situation, what is actually needed. And above the ego, the third system to develop is the superego. And the superego is really this idea that it's the voice of conscience, and it really represents morality and parental authority that we kind of internalize, and that becomes part of our personality. Now, it seems that anytime people talk about Freud, an iceberg always comes up. Now, it's important to note that Freud never described personality as being an iceberg kind of thing. That being said, the iceberg thing is actually a helpful way for us to understand. So with an iceberg, we know that about 10% of it, only about 10% of an iceberg is above the surface. All right, so only 10% of the size of the actual iceberg is visible to us at any point in time. 90% of it is below the surface. And it's a helpful way to understand that even within these personality structures, only a little bit of some of it is actually above the surface, and the rest is below the surface. So the id, focusing on the pleasure principle, is driven completely under the surface. All right, so we're not even aware. So that's in the unconscious realm. As well, some of our stuff within the superego is also in the unconscious realm. We don't even understand it. And then there's this kind of pre-conscious realm that it's, materials just below the surface. Maybe we can kind of bring it out. That's the role and the area where therapy can really be helpful. But only about 10% of our behavior is conscious, and that's what we can see in our contact with the outside world. Okay? So it basically is just meant to illustrate for you that so much of what's going on within the person, Freud conceptualized for it to be happening below the level of consciousness. Now, one of the most helpful things that Freud probably came up with, and one of the most helpful things that we can kind of keep from Freud, is this idea of defense mechanisms. So A healthy personality can keep all three systems in balance. But the moment that you have too much on either side, that's where we begin to see pathology. And so when anxiety or threat occurs due to conflict between id and societal rules, people can use defense mechanisms to alleviate this threat or this anxiety. So the ego prevents unconscious anxiety or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. Okay, so the ego is working real hard to kind of keep those things from becoming conscious. There's a very detailed video that kind of outlines a whole bunch of different defense mechanisms. But what I'd like to do is just take a brief little foray through a couple, because I think they're kind of helpful. So one of the main defense mechanisms that we often use is repression, or what we can also call motivated forgetting. And that's when we block a threatening idea, memory, or emotion from consciousness. And so we would see repression at use when a person tries, for example, to actively refuse thinking about a traumatic experience or kind of stuffing that away. Another one that often we can see this quite a bit actually in relationships, is projection. And that's where it's not my problem, it's their problem. And so what happens in projection is we repress our own unacceptable feelings and then we attribute them to someone else. So for example, a husband who barely resisted temptation to cheat on his wife is now chronically suspicious that she is in fact cheating on him. So that would be an example of projection. So this husband has not found a way to meaningfully deal with those feelings and therefore is now projecting them onto his wife's behavior. There's another one called displacement, and displacement, or the redirection of impulses, is when we direct our emotions towards things, animals, or objects that are not the real object of their feelings. So for example, if you get yelled at by your boss and you're angry when you come home, but instead of taking it out on your boss, you then take it out on your family because you're upset about what happened at work. Now, the most helpful type of defense mechanism that we could have, and really the only adaptive one that Freud identified, is what we call sublimation. And so that's when our displacement serves a higher cultural or a socially useful purpose. So for example, in this case, you might be really angry at your boss, but instead of doing anything unproductive with this, you use it in an adaptive way, and maybe you just rock out on some beautiful death metal on your guitar. So that would be this idea that even though we've got this anger, we need to do something to channel it. We're not taking it out on others, but we're using it in a way that's meaningful, throwing ourselves into art or some creative pursuit or into a sport, something where we can take this and redirect it into a more adaptive way. Regression is another one that is common, and it's when we revert to a previous phase of psychological development. And so Freud would kind of say, if an adult was throwing a temper tantrum when they don't get their way, this is their defense mechanism. Instead of, dealing with things where they're at, perhaps they're regressing to an earlier stage of development because they're not able to deal with the frustration of not getting their own way. Denial is another defense mechanism, and that's when we refuse to admit something unpleasant. So for example, denial can look like, well, I failed a lot of courses, but I'm still going to get into medical school. Yeah, probably not, right? So we have to, Freud would say that by recognizing these defense mechanisms, we can then perhaps, deal with the unconscious thing behind it. Now, it's important to note that defense mechanisms aren't just ways that we're trying to be silly about life, but these are actually things that we do to protect our self-identity. So defense mechanisms are an adaptive response to threat. Now, where it becomes maladaptive is if that becomes how we live our life. So instead of finding ways to sublimate or finding ways to adequately deal with the unconscious reasons why we're needing these defense mechanisms, that is something that's not healthy, maladaptive. Now, out of the psychodynamic theories, one of probably the largest and most powerful legacies of it is the MBTI. And when I'm saying MBTI, I'm talking about the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is a personality test of sorts. Now, the MBTI was derived from the work of Carl Jung, which was Freud's contemporary, who then kind of split off and did his own work. And Jung believed that people fall into discrete types, and these are influenced by one's level of consciousness. So, for example, he talked about that we could have these perceiving or non-rational functions, in particular sensation and intuition. And then we could also have these judging or rational functions, which would require obviously more consciousness, and those would be thinking and feeling. So each type of consciousness is impacted then by one's level of introversion or extroversion. Okay, so you've got level of consciousness kind of on one axis, and then level of introversion or extroversion. Now here's where you can see why it's a personality kind of piece. So each person's personality fits into one of 16 types, which is influenced by a combination of these 4 dimensions. So extroversion versus introversion. And so that's one's general orientation or attitude towards the world. We've got sensing versus intuition, and that's how you perceive information. So whether it's kind of fact-based and present-oriented, or if it's kind of more of a creative and trusting your gut instincts type of approach. We've got thinking versus feeling, and that's how we process emotion. So are we processing it logically or in a very emotional or emotive kind of manner? And then we have judgment versus perception. And that's how we kind of implement information. So do we kind of use like a rule-based and organized approach, or are we kind of flexible and spontaneous? So you can feel even in this that there feels to me like there's a little bit of overlap really between sensing, intuition, and judgment perception. But nevertheless, these are the 16 kind of types based on these dimensions here and combinations of dimensions with each other. Now the big question for me and for you should hopefully be, does this actually make sense? Is it actually a useful way to understand personality? So if you remember our lecture on psychometrics, one of the big components that we talked about is this idea of reliability. And so we talked about test-retest reliability. Now here's an interesting thing about the MBTI. About 50% of test takers are classified as another type after only the passing of 5 weeks. That means half of people between the time that they take the test to 5 weeks later will fall into a different grouping. Now that suggests that perhaps the test is not very good at test-retest reliability. It's not high in that particular area. Another way that we kind of look at at reliability is through what we call the standard error of measurement. Now, standard error of measurement is a statistic that tells us when the differences in test scores are meaningful or not. And so what you want is you want really small standard errors of measurement. That suggests that the test scores, the differences are not very meaningful. Now the problem is the MBTI has very large standard errors of measurement. So that suggests that there is a large error component that does not allow the test to be very reliable. The third thing that really challenges the idea of reliability is the cutoff points that are used on the MBTI. So test takers are classified on either end of a dimension based on their raw score. And there's no attention paid to the SEM. So if you're using the SEM in a meaningful way, then you have to determine whether or not the raw score and the SEM work together well. And so unfortunately, the cut points are fairly arbitrary, even with these very large SEMs. And so that makes it for a bit of a challenging thing to say that this test has a high amount of reliability. Well, now we have to then look at validity, because we know that tests can be reliable, but not valid, but if they're not reliable, they can't be valid. So here's the question. Is there an issue with validity? Well, here's what we know. So in psychology and in statistics, there's a technique called factor analysis. And it's a statistical procedure where we can kind of look at clusters of correlated items that appear to measure an underlying factor. Now, in order for you to say that this group of questions is looking at this particular factor, there should be factors that are independent of each other, right? Otherwise, what you're going to say is that, there's this kind of a mix, a mash of questions together. And so you have to have a series of independent factors, and your questions need to fall discretely into one of these factors in order for there to be meaningful interpretation. So by way of example, if I'm giving you a test, and on this test I'm telling you it's a test of anxiety and depression, well then you would expect that some of the questions have to do with anxiety and some of the questions have to do with depression, so there would be 2 factors. If though, on this test that I tell you there's questions of anxiety and depression, but really what I'm measuring is psychological distress, not either one of those other categories, well then it's not really meaningful interpretation that you can kind of pull from that. Now, the problem is here. So the MBTI should have 4 factors, right? Because we've got extroversion versus introversion, thinking versus feeling, right? So we've got those 4 kind of groups. However, one study actually showed that MBTI data produced 6 factors, with over 83% of differences between students that were not actually accounted for by the results of the MBTI. So that is a large amount of what we'd call unexplained variance. Other studies have shown that the judging perceiving and the SN, which is now I'm drawing a blank for, sensing intuition scales are very similar, right, or highly strongly correlated. And I just kind of pointed that out too before, which suggests that those 2 factors are perhaps not independent of each other. That creates some issues for validity, doesn't it? And the other issue is surrounding the test structure in and of itself. Does it make sense to classify people as either one thing or another? For example, is an introvert always introverted? Well, you and I would know the answer to that, and we'd say, well, probably not, because we know that an extrovert isn't always extroverted. We know that there is an impact of situation, right? And we can be extroverted in one context, say around our close family and friends, and perhaps we can be introverted in another context. Does forced choice responses produce the most valid results to explain human behavior? Are you either, is using a simple yes, no, or always and never a good response skill to really capture the nuances in human behavior? I would argue no. In terms of the test content, one of the important questions to ask is, does it make sense to use a test that's not actually based on a validated theory of human personality? So we know from the, and what you know from my lectures is that I've argued before that the psychodynamic theory, while very broad, has not really been able to be tested in a meaningful way. And so building a test then on content that we don't know if it actually truly measures a particular type of personality or explains particular personalities is not really a helpful way to go about testing. And then finally, generalizability. The MBTI is most commonly used to help students make decisions about occupations. However, there is no evidence to support that the traits on this instrument are predictive of anything. So should we be using this test to tell you what type of occupation you'll do well at and function well at in the future? Again, I would argue probably not. So there are particular rebuttals that the MBTI has against these arguments, and I'd like for you to take a look at them because you are very, very smart folks. And what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you, while you're doing that, to check out their reference list, use your baloney detection skills, and tell me if you see something that's perhaps missing or something that I'm missing. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I'm going to pause here, and we will pick things up in a bit.